Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, or good day wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the next episode of No Dice, No Glory. Sponsored by our jobs that actually pay us money, we're coming to you not at all live from an abandoned arms factory deep under a mountain in West Virginia. We are proud to proffer to you the finest in wargaming coverage. Without any further ado, let's get this show on the road.
Hey, well, thank you, Sean. Today we have the second in our interviews of authors of Casemate Publishing, and I'm very excited to sit down today with Aden Magee. We're going to talk about his book, The Cold War Wilderness of Mirrors, Counterintelligence and the U.S. and Soviet Military Liaison Missions from 1947 to 1990. Well, welcome, Aden. How you doing today?
I'm great, Mitch. Thanks for having me.
Oh, no problem. So, hey, a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I am a retired military intelligence officer, U.S. Army, and since I retired, I've been a consultant to the DoD, Department of Homeland Security, FBI, other agencies. So I've stayed kind of engaged in the game, so to speak. But during my Army career, I was in a wide range of units to include the elite counterintelligence unit that I commanded, which becomes kind of the central point of the book when you get to the latter portion of the text.
So, right in the beginning, are you the captain in the passes prologue section? Or you?
Yes, I am the captain. I am the commander of the unit. Okay.
Because, it's, I'm reading it, when I read it, I'm like, I have a feeling that's him. So, you have firsthand experiences. So, look, like I said yesterday, nobody wants to hear me speak. So tell me what this book's about, because I found it very interesting. And with some of the tie-ins I have, especially to Berlin, I thought it was an interesting book. But what's it about, and what motivated you to write it?
Yeah, well, first on motivation to write it is I lived a portion of the last decade of the Cold War on the streets of Europe, like I said, commanding an elite counterintelligence unit. So I had a story, me and my comrades, we had a story that we knew needed to be told before it kind of faded from human memory. So as I started to put pen to paper, I realized that we can't really just capture this one bounded period of what happened without really going back and bringing in the entire historical context of the Soviet military liaison missions from the beginning, how they evolved, how they were kind of a microcosm of the larger strategic global context. So that's why then a 5-year project became a 10-year project and so forth. And so I had to go back and start beginning with the history of the MLM. So a lot of your listeners may judge a book by its cover and think that it is just a historical treatment of the MLMs, but that's not the case. Even though it is surely the most complete treatment of the MLM history. The first, say, third of the book speaks to that because, like I said, it was necessary. This goes into much more complex issues than just the MLMs alone. So, it's not just a dry treatment of the history of the MLMs, but then it goes into some of the more, intriguing parts of the deception, the counterintelligence, the intelligence business. But it all ties in with the MLMs and then kind of culminates with our efforts to crack the nut, which was the Soviet military liaison mission in Frankfurt.
Yeah, so from reading the book, a lot of it is the history, but you go into detail of how the MLM really kind of played a huge role in counterintelligence and even our intelligence gathering. I found it was interesting. I thought I should have gotten I definitely earned my Cold War ribbon again from reading that. So the MLM started really, with the fall of Germany, and was put in place in 1947. And from reading the book, it seems like, this was supposed to be almost a temporary thing. And it kind of evolved into something a little bit more, I think, than what people intended. How do you think the MLMs changed their roles and missions throughout the entire Cold War.
Yeah, so initially they were brought in to be just what the title implies. They were to be liaison missions assigned to each of the four Allied powers at the time: the Soviets, the U.S., the Brits, and the French. Of course, very quickly, the schism formed between the Soviets and the other, what became the three allies, but it was identified that it was necessary to have liaison missions assigned to each, so there was good communication. We didn't have a strategic miscalculation. And so that's how they began. Each of the four sectors of occupied Germany each had one of the Allied MLMs located in. So each of the three allies had a Soviet MLM in their sector, and then we had each three of us had a MLM in the Soviet sector, which of course became East Germany. So the name, they were there for liaison purposes, but the provision of the agreement had one specific provision which said that each of the MLMs would be allowed complete freedom of travel throughout the other sector, except in the place of the location of military forces. So this was a pretty ambiguous provision in the agreement, but each of the sides immediately took this as charter to collect intelligence. And so each of these MLMs became the best source of direct on-the-ground intelligence of each other's forces in that key Central European area. So very quickly, the liaison function became a very secondary or tertiary mission, and the mission of the MLMs became solely overt human collection activity. And the U.S. MLM progressed very quickly into an intelligence collection machine, and it was one of the most prolific, if not the most prolific, intelligence collection capability throughout the Cold War within the DoD.
What were some of the big intel gathering coups that you think the Allied MLMs, which obviously you worked on, were responsible for during the Cold War? What was some of the highlight victory moments?
Well, I would say that their collection would be depicted as more quantity over quality for the most part. They were just very prolific, very aggressive. But it was mainly just overt movement of perhaps new equipment coming into the area, some of the training. I mean, there's the one famous case in 1984 New Year's Eve where they did get inside one of the new variants of the Soviet battle tank, and they took advantage actually of some drunk Soviet soldiers, and they got inside the battle tank and were able to take pictures from inside of the battle tank. And so that was probably the biggest coup. Unfortunately, just a few months later, the fact that had been compromised was told to the East Germans and the KGB by the infamous traitor James Hall.
Yeah. I think that was it was a T-62, I believe, right? Or a
T-64 variant, yes.
T-64 variant, too. Every day where my office is at the Pentagon, I pass by the FAO corner, and it has a picture of what's that, Major Nicholson?
Yes, Major Nicholson.
He was part of the MLMs, I believe.
Yeah, he absolutely was. In fact, it was after in 1985 he was the first U.S. casualty, or KIA we should say, of the MLMs. He was on a tour. He was going to a tank shed looking for, again, like what's the latest variant of a tank. He got out of the vehicle, was looking around. His driver was standing guard, as was the case by the car. A lone sentry came out of the wood line, shot a shot that went by the head of the driver, and then Nicholson began running towards the vehicle, basically away from the sentry. The sentry fired twice. One was a clean shot through a vital organ, and he bled out there on the ground.
Yeah, it's a horrible story. I wonder if the sentry that shot him was promoted or sent to Siberia.
Probably the latter. It became a big issue. There were negotiations that went on, but the thing is, the Soviets had consistently, since the very beginning, said that it is a sentry's order to protect his post against unknown aggressors, and so they maintained that narrative throughout the history of the MLMs. There were numerous shooting incidents that took place, obviously aimed shots throughout the years. So this was a narrative that the Soviets had professed, and so the MLMs, you could say, had been basically dodging the bullet for years, and then it finally called up to them. But even when we protested, we went through the major negotiation. The Soviets held by their contention that a sentry on guard has the responsibility to guard his post.
Yeah, they're really, anybody here that knows Soviet history, they're really big at protecting things in the air or on the ground. And it's a rather unfortunate incident. And, every time I walk past that FAO apex there at the Pentagon, I always look at that picture. And that's what kind of really got me interested reading the book. I found that history very fascinating. So you said the intel collected was quantity over quality. Was it mostly looking at troop dispositions, the introduction of new weapons in Group Soviet Forces Germany? If I was to look at all the intel they collected, what pattern would I see of what you guys were able to do during the Cold War?
Yeah, it was just basically what you said. It was order of battle type tactical intel. They would observe training. They would take pictures of the training, report on the training, report on any new equipment. There were, and I should have mentioned this, we talked about the provision of the freedom of military movement, except for the locations of military forces. That was not really defined within the provision. So by 1951, the Soviets began to issue maps with shaded areas, which were the restricted areas. And then the Allies responded in kind by providing maps of what areas they considered restricted within their location. So for the most part, both sides were pretty good about not violating the restricted areas because they would legitimately be kicked out if they were caught violating restricted area. They would be P&G. So the main collection methodology was to establish sites along the perimeter and the main routes into training areas and try to identify, any new equipment or interesting equipment that was moving in or out of the training areas at the time.
So in 1988, when you were the captain with the MLMs, I was a Soviet studies major in college. So I find this period fascinating. And one of the things that assessing Soviet military capability, one of the questions I had was, we had some great successes throughout this mission. What about the Soviets in the Warsaw Pact? Was it as effective as ours?
Well, that's where the big mystery that we kind of get to in the book goes, because, like I said, our military liaison mission was a collection machine. They had, even though they had their location in Potsdam, which is only accredited 14 personnel, they really operated out of West Berlin, where they had a massive facility. They were augmented by an additional 56 personnel. So they were rotating tour officers and tour NCOs and vehicles in and out. So they constantly had 2, 3, 4 tours ongoing in East Germany 24 hours a day. Whereas the Soviets, they didn't try to replicate any type of a cross-border capability. They were 14 people on their island in Frankfurt, which, if you're aware of the situation back then, as still is the case, even though East Germany had 20 Soviet divisions, 6 East German divisions. It was one large maneuver area. The Allies in West Germany, we respected the West German sovereignty, so training activity that was ongoing was either at garrison locations, or the big training activities were taking place at the training locations, 2 of which were in the U.S. Soviet sector, which is Grafenwehr and Hohenfels. So in contrast to the US MLM, which was constantly touring, the Soviets would go out on maybe 1 tour per day, go to the training area, check things out, and then come back, and they were back in the compound by 5 o'clock that afternoon. So they were much less aggressive in their intelligence collection. In fact, they just kind of did it enough to make it look like they care. And then, of course, in retrospect, well, we examine, what type of other clandestine activity might they have been taking? Because if you look at the history of the Soviets, allowing U.S. MLM to run roughshod over their sector while they didn't seem to be getting any kind of reciprocity in kind, that's just not the Soviet mentality. They would always overmatch us in, event collection capability, counterintelligence capability. So for them to allow that level of overmatch was just not their way of doing business. So there had to have been something more to it. But the U.S. mentality at the time was, anything we do to impact the Soviet military liaison mission in the U.S. sector is going to actually, then the Soviets are going to do something in their sector that's going to impact our collection mission. So it wasn't worth, trying to detain a Mlm, a Soviet vehicle, or trying to do something like that if they knew it was going to have a immediate and outweighed negative impact on the collection mission. So the tendency was to just leave the Soviet military liaison mission alone, as long as that didn't impact anything that was going on in the Soviet sector. So that's and so there was not a good counterintelligence mentality thinking, well, what might they be doing from that would warrant that if they're not going out touring and collecting intelligence. And then, of course, we also know in retrospect, with spies like George Trofimov, Zoltan Szabo, Clyde Conrad, James Hall, there is no information that the Soviet military liaison mission would have been able to have gained by overt collection of training activities that they weren't already getting from those spies. I mean, Conrad was providing the U.S. and NATO war plans to the Soviets as soon as they were published. So
he was the German civilian at NATO headquarters. Was that him?
No, Conrad was the war planner at the 8th ID, who had probably in compare is the debate is whether John Walker's network or the Conrad network was the most damaging during the Cold War.
Wow. Yeah, I guess you don't have much of a job if your other spies are getting really good information for you. So do you think any of the U.S. MLM folks, while they were in East Germany, ever had a moment alone in actuality, or were they always followed, bugged, surveilled?
Well, they had moments alone. I mean, the Stasi, the Stasi was a surveillance state, right?
Mm-hmm.
They were very intrusive. They were very immersive throughout, and they monitored the MLMs very aggressively because the MLMs were, frankly, the most overt risk that they knew was located on their territory. So they monitored the MLMs from a national standpoint. They had Stasi surveillance vehicles following them, trying to follow them wherever they go. They monitored with the local police to, hand off control as they move from region to region. So the very aggressive Stasi nature is what kind of impacted the U.S. MLM to adopt a very aggressive intelligence collection methodology. And primarily, that was modifications to their vehicles. They were all high performance vehicles, ruggedized for off-road travel. They had enhanced suspensions, additional 35-gallon fuel tanks. So their basic methodology was when they knew that they were being followed by the Stasi, and whenever it was time to get rid of them, the tour officer would tell the NCO to gun it. He would go, on the German autobahns very fast. Once they realized that they had kind of lost the tail, they would pull off into one of their pre-planned off-road locations to hide, watch the Stasi vehicles go by, and then they would normally go in lights out mode with infrared goggles on, cross country, not going back out onto the other road to the roads where they would be seen, but going cross country to their target location, get a couple of hours sleep, and then wake up in the morning and begin their collection mission.
Wow. So I'm sure some of the members of the missions on both sides were the target of intel operatives. Were any of them able to ever get turned?
Well, that is that's a point of pride with the U.S. MLM alumni, is that they were the only intelligence collection element in Berlin that was never penetrated by the KGB. So, that's good, but it also it would make you wonder what was so special about them that they were able to do it when none of the other agencies would. And my contention is that the KGB and the Stasi identified that the trade-off was not worth it, because if they were identified to be trying to recruit U.S. MLM members to work for them, then that probably wouldn't be enough to be a deal breaker, but it may force the U.S. or compel the U.S. to be a little more aggressive against the Soviet MLM. So I think that as long as the Soviet MLM was able to just fly below the radar, that the on the other side, the KGB, the Stasi, they didn't want to do anything that might bring attention to the issue. And then again, when we talked about Trofimov, Conrad, Hall, those, in addition to providing war plans, they were also providing all the information that U.S. MLMs were providing. So for that entire period where it appeared that we were just running roughshod and collecting intel all over the place, they had a pretty good idea of all of the MLM reporting, because of course anybody in Germany or in Washington who was involved in watching the Soviet target, who was involved in any war plans or plans against the Soviets, they were obviously a very avid consumer of all U.S. MLM reporting. And we know that George Trofimov and Clyde Conrad provided everything that was in their vaults, which certainly included all U.S. MLM reporting.
I listened to a podcast on Trofimov, also very interesting, because they didn't catch him till years later, I believe.
Right. He was the first one. He started in 1967, and he worked in the Joint Interrogation Facility, which certainly, they got all the latest USMLM reporting or USMLM reporting because they needed to have that so they could verify the validity of the individuals that they were debriefing or interrogating. Because again, the Joint Interrogation Facility was just getting tactical UMINT, the type of reporting that USMLM gave. So he continued until 1987 when he was told by the KGB to stop. And we don't know exactly, there are a couple of theories of why they would have told him to stop, but we don't know exactly why. But there was a defector who came across in 1992, which identified Trofimov as a spy. And but the Germans only have a 5-year statute of limitations on espionage, and he had exceeded that 5 years. So they tried to arrest him and put him on trial, but he didn't. He did not confess, so he was not sentenced. But he made the mistake of relocating to the United States, which of course does not have a statute of limitation.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
Trofimov was the highest-ranking U.S. Military spy because he was a colonel in the reserve. So a few years later, he was arrested in Tampa, Florida, put on trial and tried for life. But by then the Cold War was long over. The damage that he had done was something of a time gone by. So those people were more interested in a guy that was in their retirement community being arrested than they were as far as the actual damage he had done. And what impact that would have had the Cold War gone hot.
So looking at operational planning for both sides, how much do you think the MLMs influenced EUCOM, NATO plans and Warsaw Pact operations plans during their existence?
Well, they had a big impact from the standpoint of they were able to provide the most up-to-date information regarding the order of battle. The Soviet group of forces, Germany, was the main effort if the Soviets were to attack across the Fulda Gap and into Europe. So they were providing the best firsthand information, even though there were restricted areas throughout. There's no way that the Soviets would have been able to mobilize and amass forces for an attack without the MLMs being able to see some indication of that. So from that standpoint, they were very important.
So in the book, you mentioned a little Spetsnaz interaction with the MLMs. Let's say the balloon did go up. The MLMs are essentially in enemy territory. Are they the first POWs that would be taken in a hypothetical World War III?
Yeah, so there's kind of the debate that goes on that the MLM served a purpose in that they were a deterrent to war. They were a confidence building measure that if they an indication of war would come if they closed down their MLMs. And so some people thought that was kind of a confidence measure. But the reality is, we know from the war plan that was leaked in 1960 that the Soviets planned to be to the Belgian border by within 72 to 96 hours or something crazy like that. We saw the invasion of Afghanistan in '79 and saw exactly how they used their Spetsnaz or sleeper agents to literally cut off the head of the leadership. And we know that their plan was that they needed to have Spetsnaz special forces and sleeper agents in NATO countries because they wanted to, again, literally cut off the head of the leadership before they could make the decision to release nuclear weapons. So yeah, I think that the Soviet attack, had it come, the plan was for it to come fast and hard. The embassies, the MLMs, they would have been considered collateral damage, or they may have had go to war, go to ground missions, kind of like our D-Day in Berlin had, because essentially they would be immediately behind enemy lines. So they may have had some type of a wartime mission, but they were going to die in place.
Yeah, which it's kind of interesting what their role would be. So your book mentions Able Art, and for those folks that are listening, everything that we've talked about is in the book. Because I can't think there's anything we talked about that really wasn't. But you mentioned Able Archer. What role did the MLMs play in getting the Soviets to understand it was just a command post exercise and it wasn't a prelude to a first strike?
Well, I'm not sure that the MLMs really played too much of a role. I mean, obviously they had a direct channel of liaison, and there was much back and forth there. But really, when with the Soviets and Able Archer, I mean, you have to kind of understand that era, and that really kind of speaks to how surprised those of us who were fighting the Cold War at the time were surprised that during the '80s, when the things were most contentious, was actually kind of the end of the era for the Cold War. Because if you were living in '83 when Able Archer was going on, you didn't think this was the most intense period of the Cold War. And this was Able Archer was the first NATO exercise to actually authorize nuclear weapons or play nuclear weapons being provided down to the user level. And when the Soviets saw this, they were obviously very concerned to the fact that they thought that we were preparing for a nuclear attack, but it was really a Soviet, a U.S. agent, a GRU agent that the CIA was running, which was providing information that told us how seriously the Soviets were taking this. So we kind of ratcheted down the rhetoric and the activity, knowing that they were really taking this as a serious threat of a nuclear war.
Yeah, I find that whole thing really pretty interesting, and it was kind of revisited when I watched Deutschland '83 with the final episode, which was about Able Archer, which is a question I was going to get to, but maybe it's a good time, good time now. So, in the last few years, we've seen like Bridge of Spies, and I just finished watching the movie with the British agent that went into Moscow. I forgot his name, forgot the name of the movie. But this stuff's been covered by movies. And same question, when we speak to Benderson Little about the pirates, what do movies and pop culture get wrong about this period? What are some of the things that when you see, you're just like, we just get totally wrong when it comes to movies and other types of media?
Yeah, well, I think that it's some are better than others.
Hello?
We can talk about the shows like The Americans, which are not totally realistic, but they do capture the mentality of the time. And so I would say that it's very hard to depict either in a movie or book or whatever, just what was the Cold War mentality of that time. And Able Archer gets to it, but that was a period where we thought that we were in a existential battle for the heart and soul of the world against the communists. And when I came in 1979 and first put on the uniform, I thought that this was going to be fighting the Soviets would be my life for the next 30 or 40 years. So none of us saw the Cold War coming, and there was a mentality that that even during the 2000 global war on terrorism, there was never this live or die kind of mentality that we felt every day, operating in the streets and the fields of Central Europe.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, I came in at the tail end of the Cold War, And I worked nuclear ops, so I'm kind of glad I never had to do that job. But you guys saw it close up every day. Were there any times that you personally felt this is not going in a good direction, that we're misreading each other's intentions and capabilities, and it could have led to something happening?
Well, I don't think personally felt at the time. I was kind of really focused on my specific mission. But you mentioned Able Archer, and that was the kind of touch point moment where if we did ever come close to nuclear war, that was definitely the closest that we came, and that's when we started to kind of ratchet things down just a little bit. But that was the key area, and that's why. And Gorbachev even said it. The French president said it, that between 1980 and 1985 was the absolute tensest time throughout the Cold War, or that we had ever had. And then with Gorbachev coming in 85, 86 with a kind of a new philosophy, that started to ratchet down just a little bit. But during the time when Gorbachev was preaching perestroika and trying to reach out to mainly get money, elements within the central government, like the KGB, like the GRU, who knew that their power was based on having this enemy, the United States, that they could always, say is an existential threat and would give them their power. So they knew that if they lost the United States as this enemy, they would lose their power. So there were a lot of rogue actions that were going on that were not authorized by the central government. You would look at probably the 1986 LaBelle disco bombing in
Yeah,
Berlin,
I remember that.
given what Gorbachev was professing, to the rest of the world. It's impossible to think that he would have thought that was a good idea, but it's also impossible to think that the Libyans could have pulled off anything like that in Berlin without the Stasi and then in turn the KGB knowing about it. So there were a number of activities that were going on, that were not consistent with what the central government was saying. And in the book, we also discussed some cases that I observed personally, which we think were, if there was an explanation, it had to do with rogue KGB activities.
So one of the things from reading the book is your research. I know sometimes when you actually do something, um, to go and provide additional research is sometimes not easy. I know that from experience. What was one of the things that, as you were researching this book, that you learned that you really weren't aware of, or played a major role when you were actually performing these missions?
Right. Well, from where I started the book to where it ended up was completely, I thought, again, I thought it was going to be kind of a little bounded story about a period in time, and then it kind of exploded to what it is now, and I'm very glad it did. A lot of the information in the book, and again, I waited 30 years because it was information that I didn't think would ever be able to be told. But
Hmm.
I went through numerous Freedom of Information Act requests for declassification of documents, and I was frankly pretty surprised at some of the information that I was able to get declassified. One example, if I knew that when we were located, when I operated and I owned the counterintelligence element that, among its other missions, had the counterintelligence coverage mission of the Soviet Military Liaison Mission in Frankfurt. I knew that we had an observation post in an apartment directly across from the compound. But as I went through the Freedom of Information Act and started to get information, I didn't realize that that observation post had existed there since 1958, and in 1960 it was established because there was a major effort, failed effort, to conduct a technical attack against the new facility that was being built by emplacing bugs. And so we established that observation post initially as a listening post, and I also came to find that it had been compromised basically in 1960. And so, I was never aware of that history, but we continued to keep it on the books, probably because we just didn't want to say that it was a failure. So, every month of every year for the next 40 years, we had a German national employee would pull money out of our contingency fund and go pay the rent for that observation post, and it was very rarely, if ever, used. I mean, the main time we used it is when we conducted a overt surveillance of the Soviet Military Liaison Mission in response to the Nicholson shooting that we were speaking to earlier.
Yeah, it was so classified we can't even tell people that are involved anything about it.
Right.
So the book Wilderness of Mirrors, you picked that as a subtitle. Why did you feel, or why did you pick Wilderness of Mirrors for those that haven't read it yet?
Yeah, Wilderness of Mirrors is a kind of a theory that was developed by James Angleton, who was he's probably the most iconic figures in U.S. counterintelligence for both good and bad reasons. But he was the chief of CIA counterintelligence from 1954 to 1974, which is, read my book. I have an entire chapter that talks about the strategic wilderness of mirrors. And if you're not familiar with this era of espionage, you'll be absolutely amazed at how everything was so interwoven, intertwined, how the Soviets were very good at their efforts of misinformation, misdirection, agent provocateurs. You never knew who was telling the truth, who was not telling the truth, who was trying to lead you in this direction. So the wilderness of mirrors is the concept that Angleton came up with, which is that initially when two mirrors face each other, they reflect into each other into affinity. And as you keep adding mirrors, it becomes even more difficult to see where that first reflection starts or when the last one ends. And so the wilderness of mirrors is kind of a characterization of this world of espionage and intrigue where you didn't really understand if you could believe what you were seeing, if you could believe what you were being told. And there was a lot of false defectors, false agents in place, things like that that were going on. And the Soviets, they were the absolute masters of what we referred to as the deception theory, which was they would
Marishkarovka.
Yep, they would they would have well-placed moles within intelligence agencies, and they would not only just use these moles to provide intelligence, but they would use these moles to misdirect the intelligence agencies, or perhaps if we were getting too close to identifying one of their agents, they would perhaps compromise another agent to pull us off in that direction. So it was just an amazing time of espionage and intrigue that was going on there. And we have a number of great stories that we allude to in the book. And we don't just do it from the standpoint of let's tell this great story, but of course we're able to tie that back into the deception and intrigue that was the military liaison missions in Germany.
Yeah, which I actually used that recently in a meeting. Especially we were talking about information operations. And I said, the wilderness of mirrors and people perk their ears up because it's such an effective term, and I think it's just having it on the book cover really kind of drew me in, and whoever picked that picture for the front cover did an amazing job.
Yep, I'll have to give Casemate credit for that. But yeah, and the interesting thing is in the book, and judge for yourself, but there are a number of intelligence, counterintelligence, disinformation principles that we bring out kind of as learning points throughout the book. And if you look at what the Soviets are doing today, if you look at what the communist Chinese are doing today as far as deep fakes, disinformation, all that type of stuff, they're still up to the same game. They were the master then, and they're showing that they're still the masters today.
So our allies, I believe, also had MLMs. Were they as effective? Did they use them in the same way as we used ours?
They used them in the same way. They the U.S. MLM, the Brits referred to them as cowboys. The U.S. MLM was very aggressive in their intelligence collection. The Brits were not quite as aggressive, but they were very effective, and they did the same type of overt intelligence collections. And both of them said the French were a little less aggressive of the three, but they operated together. They broke down the Soviet sector into basically three large areas, and then an area just around Berlin, but really three large areas. And they kind of cut the sector in so they could concentrate their collection in one of those three areas, and then after 2 weeks they'd trade the area off and give it to the other MLM. So they had a very methodical approach to how they did this. And, it's kind of interesting also is that, when the agreement was written, it was that each of these equal allies would each have one MLM. But as it turned out, it was really the three allies against one. So we had three MLMs concentrated in the one Soviet sector, whereas they only had one in each of the three allied sectors, which gets us back to the question: why would the Soviets have allowed this degree of overmatch if they weren't getting something out of having MLMs located in West Germany?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people escape that fact, and for people our age, we remember the fear, especially in the '80s, of the Soviet Union. That it was very contentious, and it wasn't helped by movies like The Day After and other things that happened. I remember when Gorbachev took over, it was like a breath of fresh air, or at least so it appeared. From speaking to your former adversaries that did the same mission, first of all, did you have access to any of them? And one thing, just to get out to some of the listeners, they were pretty scared of us too. Any thoughts on that?
Well, first, no, we didn't. I didn't have access to any of the Soviets. Um, they're not allowed. The Soviets still have the shroud of secrecy that's been over them for the last, since 1917. So to be able to actually get in and speak with somebody who could provide that firsthand information is, not possible, unfortunately. Now, of course, we do have all the Stasi files, which provided a lot of information on some things. They had a case where there were a couple of U.S. MLM officers who said they were drugged. They were charged with drunk driving after an event, leaving the Soviet military liaison, their counterpart. And then Stasi documents released 30 years later said, yes, in fact, the Soviets had conducted a drugging event to embarrass the officers. So we did start to find some information. Also, there was a French MLM officer who was killed by a vehicle ramming in 1984, almost to the day before Nicholson was shot. And then it was discovered later through Stasi documents that was in fact a planned and intentional event to punish an officer who they said had been unnecessarily aggressive in their reconnaissance mission.
Yeah, it's interesting. East German roads, and especially driving in East Berlin, you have to be careful of not getting hit by a Trabant at all times, even if you were sitting in a restaurant.
Yeah, well, these were pretty big gas military vehicles that were normally involved in those type of rammings.
Yeah. It was such a fascinating time. So the missions with the end of the Cold War went away. Was there any thought to keeping a similar type mission in place to ensure that we didn't have an accidental war? And looking at it today, it was in the news today about well, it's been in the news for the last week, Soviet buildup on the Ukrainian border. Is there a need for this type of mission today?
Yeah, always. Anytime you could put some type of a confidence building mechanism in place, I think we found that it serves a purpose, which is why we have a number of confidence building measures that we have with the Soviets that are in place. Now, obviously, it didn't apparently work so well in the Ukraine, but yeah, I think they serve a purpose. But as far as the U.S. MLMs, they were always a stain for both the East and the West Germans. They were always seen as, they were really the last vestige of occupation. They were seen as a wartime reparation, and they were a national embarrassment. And the only reason that the Germans, didn't fight the fact that they were remaining there was one, there was never a peace treaty ending the war, so we could stay there as long as we wanted. And
Hmm.
two, it served a purpose in making sure that they didn't, again, become the biggest battlefield in the world or a nuclear wasteland. So it did serve that purpose. But as soon as they became a unified country, it was important for them as a matter of national pride to get rid of any vestige of the post-war occupation. So the MLMs closed down, the day before German reunification. The Germans did partner with what had been the USMLM to form another element, was the Combined Action Group Berlin, something like that. Because as you recall, even though Germany reunified, the Soviet group of forces were still in East
Right.
Germany, and they were 20 divisions. So it takes a while to get that big of a force out. So they weren't, they remained in East Germany, or in what was East Germany, for another 4 years. So there was a very active joint U.S. West German collection mission against those elements as well. And there are some interesting stories, because you'd find that Soviet soldiers, when they're getting ready to leave, were very willing to sell equipment and other things that to make some money on the side. So we were able to provide, even buy tanks and things like that.
So that's why you drive around today in the BRDM?
Yeah, that's it. You saw.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize the fact that they were there for quite some time afterwards. One of the things, just to bring up, when was the last time I really thought about the effects of the Cold War? And it was when I was at Station Aviano in '99 during Operation Allied Force, right in the middle of some of our heaviest sortie days. The CFE, Conventional Forces Europe, decided to have an inspection. So there we have a lot of Russian officers walking around our base as we're conducting operations against an ally of theirs. I just thought that people are like, why are they here? And I said, well, we had this Cold War thing with them. Some of you guys may have heard about that. And, this is kind of a vestige from that. But he goes, well, what are they here to inspect? I go, well, I don't think they're here to inspect as much as they're here to collect intelligence. So these things still go on today.
Oh yeah, and I think immediately after the Cold War, for at least from our standpoint, there was a little bit of a honeymoon. We didn't see them as a lingering threat. We kind of cashed in a lot of our capabilities, because we didn't think that the Soviet threat would exist, and it appeared that it didn't. And then of course the whole Putin era came in, and we're back at it. So I think that they were able to kind of take advantage of us letting our guard down a little bit
Yeah,
there.
yeah, which is unfortunate. Um, I think first of all, I want to thank you. This was awesome. Um, I said this before. I really enjoyed this book. I felt that it was a topic I couldn't find another book, and I love reading about the Stasi. And there's so many really good books, about intel collection. But this one goes into a depth that few other books go into, and I think it's your personal touch. And with the subject matter, this was something you did that I think brings it right to the forefront. The detail you go into, it's not a dry read. It's actually pretty fascinating. And I think the chapter, the strategic implications, is one that I've actually read a few times. Like most people know, I conduct war games, and just trying to look at, intel collection and how it affects certain parts of operations. I thought that that chapter was great. And when I was at Historicon, I finally met Daniel, and somebody was looking at your book. It was right there on the table. And I said, that's a really good book. If you had any questions about how counter-espionage worked, especially with this singular mission that touched almost everything that went on during that period, that's a good book. Now, I don't know if he bought it because I had to leave, but I hope folks out there that find any of this interesting is to go to Casemate Publishing and pick up the book. I really enjoyed it right away. Whoever at Casemate, like I said, picked out that cover of the, I believe that's a Stasi officer.
Yeah.
Or a Stasi border guard, looking at me with a, I'm looking at it right now, and it's just scary. And then, you have the SA-7s there at the bottom. I think it was a good book. And I think folks out there that really should pick this book up. I think it tells a story that you're not going to see anywhere else. So in the future, are we going to see any more books continuing with this theme?
I've been that's the question that I'm asked. Really, this was this was kind of a life mission, a passion to get this one story out. I'm very glad that you liked it, because like I said, where I started and where I ended was completely different, but I'm very pleased and satisfied with where it ended. But as far as I'm concerned, this was the story that I wanted to get out before it faded from human memory, before it was lost in the sands of time. So from that standpoint, mission accomplished, and I don't have any other projects looming right now. But I do regularly, if you Google my name, you'll see that I contribute articles to professional journals all the time, and so I'm always writing on different subjects. But as far as my next 10-year project, I don't have that one planned yet.
It's too bad. There's so much of the story to tell, and you bring about, you raise a very important point before this fades from memory, because while it has faded, I think, from recent memory, and, people now serving in today's military don't remember a separate West Germany. It's like, or an East, they just they don't have context for it. There's so much of that story, I think, that should get out there, because these are not unique events. We see a lot of events in history happening over and over again, and just to get the word out there. So, for the folks that are out there listening to this, this will come out right after Thanksgiving. But Aden, I want to wish you have a great Thanksgiving. All
right, Mitch, thank you, and it's been great talking with you. This has been a blast.
Yeah, it has. And then I'm going to end the podcast, and then I have a couple of questions I didn't want to ask, or a couple of things to say I didn't want to ask. And people always ask, "What do you guys talk about afterwards?" And I'm like, yeah, usually nothing special. But yeah, this was this was fun. And please, anytime you want to come on and talk about something that you're writing or doing, love to have you back. So I'm going to turn it back to Sean in the studio. And thank you, sir, so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for joining the show tonight. Remember to follow us on Twitter at No Dice, No Glory. And keep the conversation going on NoDiceNoGlory.com, now featuring our own message boards. Have a great night, everybody.